Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into historian Heather Cox Richardson's really stark warning that American democracy is being systematically replaced by a system of rule by the wealthy for the wealthy.
So, how exactly does Heather Cox Richardson build this case? Well, here's our roadmap. We're going to start by looking at a pretty controversial foreign policy proposal. Then, we'll get into what she means by this new system. After that, we'll dig into the evidence she lays out, and finally, explore the populist backlash that she says it's creating. All right, let's jump in. So, Richardson's whole analysis really kicks off with a report from the Wall Street Journal. It revealed this kind of startling plan for peace in Ukraine, a plan that looks, very different from your typical diplomacy.
Now listen to the language here. A key envoy, Steve Witkoff, he isn't talking about national security or democratic ideals. Nope. He frames the whole plan as a business deal, a path to prosperity through joint U.S. and Russian economic ventures in Ukraine.
Well, you can imagine, this approach drew some pretty sharp criticism, and not just from the other side of the aisle. Here you have Republican Representative Don Bacon saying he's alarmed, calling out a foreign policy that might be driven by personal profit instead of, what's right. And this is where Heather Cox Richardson really zeroes in. For her, this clash of visions, one all about joint profit, the other about doing the right thing, it points to something way bigger. She says it's a major sign of a deliberate change in how our government actually works. And that brings us to the core concept in Heather Cox Richardson's entire analysis, kleptocracy. You've probably heard the word before, but what it actually means is crucial to understanding her whole argument.
Okay, so here's the key. A kleptocracy isn't just about a few corrupt individuals. It's when the whole system, the government itself, is basically rewired to serve the private financial interests of a tiny group of elites at the top.
And this, right here, is the heart of her argument. Heather Cox Richardson is saying that what we're seeing isn't an accident. It's not a bunch of isolated incidents. It is a deliberate, active effort to replace American democracy with this kleptocratic model.
So that's a huge claim, right? What evidence does Heather Cox Richardson actually bring to the table to support it? Well, she points to a pattern that connects massive wealth, government policy, and the use of presidential power. First up, she points to reporting from the New York Times on an advisor named David Sachs. So he's advising the White House on AI policy, but at the same time, he's investing in AI companies. Then he sets up meetings between tech CEOs like the head of NVIDIA and the White House. And what happens next? Policy changes that directly benefit those exact companies. And we are not talking about small change here. The numbers are just staggering. That one policy change, lifting restrictions on chip sales, could be worth up to $200 billion to a single company, NVIDIA. Richardson then brings an analysis from Tom Burgess at The Guardian. He suggests that the line between a family's business interests and the nation's interests is basically disappearing. He even draws a direct line to petrol monarchies, where the ruling family's wealth and the country's wealth are the exact same thing. Next, Heather Cox Richardson looks at how executive power is being used, focusing on the case of David Gentile. Gentile was a private equity executive, and he was convicted in a massive fraud scheme. His sentence? Commuted. And just to be clear, this was no small-time crime. We're talking about a $1.6 billion fraud. It completely wiped out the savings of more than 10,000 investors. As one victim said, "I lost my whole life savings." And this is a really important point Heather Cox Richardson makes. Who were the victims here? As you can see, these weren't Wall Street gamblers. Prosecutors said they were just hardworking, regular people, small business owners, teachers, nurses, people whose life savings just vanished. So according to Richardson, when you see this pattern, policies that benefit the super wealthy, pardons that protect convicted elites, it's fueling this growing public anger. And that anger has given birth to a new and really potent political term. So what is the Epstein class? Well, it's a phrase that really captures this growing feeling that there is an elite group that just operates by a completely different set of rules. Representative Ro Khanna breaks it down pretty clearly. He describes it as a group of people with so much wealth that they use their money and their political donations to create a system where basically the rules just don't apply to them. So Heather Cox Richardson pulls all this together to paint a picture of this group. It's not just about being rich, it's about being part of this global, borderless network. Their loyalty isn't to a country or its citizens, it's to each other. and they operate with what seems like a total disregard for how their actions affect everyone else. Okay, so all this growing anger, it doesn't just stay on the internet. It's having real, actual political consequences. Heather Cox Richardson says it's fueling a really powerful populist backlash. And she gives us a perfect example of this in action. Take a look at a recent special election in Virginia. A 34-year-old Democrat, John McAuliffe, managed to flip a Republican seat. And he did it by focusing on a kitchen table issue. People's electricity bills were skyrocketing. But here's the kicker. It was how he framed it that really hit home. He didn't just complain about prices. He called the rate hikes an artificial tax on everyday people, basically a hidden subsidy for some of the richest corporations on the planet. That message, it really landed with voters. So for Heather Cox Richardson, when you connect all these dots, the foreign policy for profit, the pardons for the rich, the rise of this Epstein class, and the populist anger, it all adds up to a truly historic moment. She argues we are living through a major political realignment, one that's a lot like the big upheaval of the 1930s.
And this is where Heather Cox Richardson leaves us. She ends her whole analysis with this powerful quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt from that last great political realignment. FDR called his campaign a crusade to restore America to its own people. The question Richardson leaves hanging in the air is this: are we living through a similar moment today? And if we are, who is going to answer that call to arms?